We're going to talk about mobile payments, which I don't think anyone here would discount that it's a huge market. I think just yesterday we had a discussion, and I was blown away. I mean, everyone throws out the numbers all the time, but at dinner yesterday we were talking about how there are 5 million, correct me if I'm wrong, Bo, 500 million Chinese consumers shopping online in China. And the opportunity that I see that I'm excited about is, and they recognize global brands and they're interested in shopping overseas now in the cross-border commerce space. And only 9 out of 10 retailers outside of China, international retailers, accept China UnionPay, which is the payment, the only payment sometimes it feels like, but the preferred payment for Chinese. So just to kick it off there, if I can have each of you, what I'm interested about in this panel, it's very diverse. From Jim's perspective, we have an investor point of view who has been involved actually in China's mobile payment space since what year?
2005.
Yeah, so really early on. So we'd love to share the insights of what you see in the space coming from your perspective. And Tynan, you are a LA-based mobile payments company that your company looked into China, but actually chose at the time and currently at the time not to pursue that because there are obviously other large opportunities or markets that you're going after. So I would love to hear that perspective. And Bo is the CEO of NiHao Pay, and he's coming up at it from the perspective of very bullish on cross-border China payments and unlocking the Chinese consumer for the global retailers. So if each of you can just go into a little bit more detail on your interest in mobile payments specific to China or your thoughts on it. You want to go start, Bo?
Okay, I will start. Hey everybody, my name is Bo. I'm the CEO of RFI. We're facilitating the cross-border payments from China to global businesses. Definitely, we have our own insights about how Chinese consumers will use their mobile payments in this particular topic, and also in commerce in general, about how they wanted to pay and to use their own payment methods to connect globally. Yeah, that's an overview.
Hi everyone, Tynan Schmidt, VP of Product at Kuapay Technologies. We're a mobile payment platform, and really, when you talk about any product, you're talking about going into China or any other country, and you're talking technology, I think you quickly start talking about marketing, and in fact, that's where we've started to put our focus. So we're really a mobile payment platform and marketing platform as well. And when we looked into a variety of markets, we were in Spain, we're in the US, and we were looking at Latin America and China. And we quickly realized that China was something that you had to focus 100% on. It is difficult, you have to build partnerships. So that's often the difficulty. I heard some of the other panelists talking about that, but it's not a hurdle you can't get over. It's just sometimes as companies you have to make choices, and we chose Latin America. So I'm probably the black sheep of the panelists up here, but I hope I can offer any other experience from both being in Latin America and having talked in China as well.
My name is Jim Robinson. I run a venture firm called RRE Ventures. We have been investing in payments-related technologies for about 20 years. Most of that has been in the U.S. market, some of it overseas, in fact, some of it in Latin America, and a little bit in China as well. As an investor, we spend our time thinking about how device propagation changes the dynamic for how people pay for things. And that's true in a couple of ways. One is sort of what I call cognitive payments, and those are payments that we consciously make. But the other kind of payment that people don't talk about as much, but I think you will see grow dramatically in the coming years, are automatic payments. So you can imagine, for instance, a scenario where rather than have a subscription to something, your device will just automatically pay whatever small incremental amount it is to, say, read an article in a newspaper, that sort of thing, or share it. So we think about secular trends. We think of them globally. We do a lot of analysis of different countries and topologies for networks and propagation of payment systems and invest. Again, most of it's here, and of course the world is a very uneven place right now in terms of payment systems, which is frankly what makes it fun.
And just a little note, Jim and I go quite a few years back when I had a startup called Affinity China, and what I noticed 3 to 5 years ago, I lose track of time, but it's probably more than 5 years ago, there was an increasing amount at that time of China going global, Chinese consumers and Chinese tourists and Chinese business people starting to arrive in the US. And then as a result, there was an increase in luxury brands that would reach out to us. Tourism boards and cities, economic development boards would reach out to us because they're trying to figure out how to market to this massive, again, the numbers, 500 million, or what they were throwing out was 100 million tourists coming to, going global every year. And the thing I was always struck by was I'm like, I would love to sit here for 2 hours and give you free China consulting based on my 20 years of experience about how to market to the Chinese, but there's absolutely no reason for me to do so if you're not accepting payments that the Chinese actually can pay you with. What's the good of marketing if you can't, accept payments when you've got them in? So I would love to hear your perspective, Bo, because this is exactly the market that you're going after right now, the cross-border, the Chinese either traveling over or from their home in China starting to purchase online. Can you give us a little bit of a backstory on what kind of opportunity that really is for people?
Yeah, totally. That's what our vision is to facilitate the global payments to Chinese consumers. And speaking of earlier stats that you gave, 500 million online shoppers in China right now. And just a little while ago, 2 months ago, the CNNIC actually reported that over that 500 million, more than 360 million are payment hosters. Most of them are shopping online, but more than 70% of them is using payments. And of that 370 something million people who are using payments, 265 million are using mobile. We're speaking of our topic today, it's going great amount. And speaking of transaction-wise, over 46% is on global currently. So China definitely have a massive, numbers on shoppers, and especially online shoppers right now. Probably will become it is the largest right now, but will become the largest as U.S., French, Japan all combined by 2017, if I don't remember it wrong. They just have a massive market currently. And better yet, all the Chinese are going global because they want to get better service, better products. As you speak before, travel is a huge industry that people want to spend their money off of, outside China. And also cross-border e-commerce is also another trend. It's going by 25% every year. And Chinese are looking to buy all the quality products overseas and have them shipped to China directly.
So to be clear, the merchants that you work with, and this may be in the beginning, a lot of times people think, well, we're not in China. Like our retailer or our boutique or our company or brand is not actively in China yet. But what you offer them is the ability to still sell to Chinese, even though they don't actually have an on-presence in China strategy, right?
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Our head of marketing, Gabe, he called it a step 1, 2, 3 thing. And the traditional way of going to China, every single possible business that's trying to open up China market, they would think about, as Tynan speak about a little bit, think about marketing, think about distributions, think about strategies into China. But currently, it's not so much of now. Like there is a new way of how American business or global business tap into the Chinese market by just enable the payments first, because there are more than, just in 2014 itself, more than $57 billion spending by Chinese sitting in China trying to shop around the world. They find their way out to find the right product fit for them, and they wanted to pay directly.
Great.
And get it back to them, basically.
Thanks for the insight. And Tynan, you're not off the hook just yet. You thought this was a China-only panel, and I wasn't going to call on you as the black sheep. You know, your focus on the Latin American market is actually very, very relevant, and I'll tell you why. Whenever I am in conversation with people about China, from the perspective of a U.S. perspective, and I'm talking to them about an emerging market, you know, when I'm talking to friends who also are from India or from Latin America, there's still a lot of parallels with the emerging market and the just leapfrogging of payment systems straight to mobile. So if you can touch upon your experience of the Latin American market, I think we can listen in on how that still relates to China and other markets in general.
I'll try. Two thoughts come to me. One is there's a very strong similarity between both markets, and it's kind of diverting away from your question a little bit, but there are a lot of people who have cell phones but are unbanked. So that's one interesting thing. The second one is the technology is primary. You have to build the technology. You have to get the technology to work. But once you get that working, the next question is, why are people going to utilize it? In the case of websites and getting there and being able to make a payment, that's kind of a passive experience. In other words, once it's done and it works, great. Now you got to figure out, how do you get this in front of the consumer? How do you do that in China? How do you do that in Latin America? And that becomes the next challenge. In the case of mobile, you actually have the consumer right there on the phone. So that becomes, for us, one of the more engaging and interesting ways to get people to understand how you can market. If I can give you a phone and I can communicate to somebody, you can make a payment, and they go make a payment in your store, you now have full circle, full cycle marketing, and now you can remarket to that person, and you have a tremendous amount of learnings. That'll be the same thing in China. But when you think of the 500 million people out there and the roughly 350 million in China who have a credit card, there are probably twice as many people who don't, and they have a cell phone. So that's what was interesting. When we talked to China UnionPay, or we actually talked to a associate through them, that was something they were very interested in, because a lot of people in China are getting paid at the location. In other words, they are out in the farms, they're out in the communities outside. So if there is a payment to be made, it has to come from the city there. If you could do it from your phone and the banks found a way to draw that connection, now all of a sudden you have a consumer with a phone that they can go and make those payments. So it's really interesting to see how China can actually lead a very interesting charge into getting the unbanked onto a technology and utilizing it.
Great. And it's not to say you guys have, you know, you looked into the market and you're coming up, but it's not to say you wouldn't revisit an approach to that market.
Correct.
Again.
No, you know, the payment tech, if you talk to anybody in banks, they will just tell you, like, payment technology, what are you doing? This is hard, this is difficult, and it is. But I feel there's just an instinct that tells me some of the next 2 years, a lot of things are going to open up. And it's not just because of Apple Pay. It's because of a variety of things happening in different cultures. Again, interestingly enough, and I don't know this, but I would imagine China in the last 10 years has a lot of new technologies going in, so they're probably easier to accept some of the new technologies that we're developing. That's why we're in Latin America. A couple of reasons. One is that they actually have newer technology systems, so it's easier, kind of easier to be more pliable with them. The second reason is the US, I heard somebody in the early panel say the same thing, the US is a quagmire in the payments industry, and you have to peel away layers to get in there, whereas in economies like in Chile, it's much easier to get deployed there. It's still hard. I don't know about China. That would be a good question to ask.
Great, thank you. Well, I happen to know someone who would be able to touch upon that. So one of the things I usually get jealous about with VCs and investors is you guys get to look at all the cool stuff, right, when they're like at ideation phase and decide if you want to fund them or not. But what happens is you get this picture, this broad picture of what's coming next, which is super exciting. So if you can share without, you know, breaking any, you know, friend DA or NDA clauses, what is exciting to you from an investor standpoint? What are you looking at, you know, aside from the cross-border China, which you're involved with? Abra is another one that's Bitcoin related, right? And then just your entire history of the different ways you can get people to pay via mobile. We'd love your insight on from an investor standpoint.
So a couple of themes that have been touched on in one case and not yet another. What makes money and payments generally defined different than just about everything else is there's that third intermediary out there, which is the financial institutions. So in other words, in a world where you have a network device on your person, it wants to be able to talk to any other networked device in the world. And it can, except in payments. In payments, you've got to have some sort of third-party intermediary, and this is true in almost all countries in the world. Yes, they differ in many different ways, and they have regulatory oversights that can vary, but nonetheless, really pretty much everywhere you're going to have to deal with a third-party intermediary which performs the credit and the authentication process. And that makes it very, very difficult. So one of the things that we're focused on are next generation payment systems where that is no longer the case. And it's a little bit the question of what is a bank and who is a bank. Now there's another player at the table here, which is the carrier player. And you know, all of the conversations we're having run through carrier systems, some more advanced than others, and Mbesa obviously in Kenya and others, because they have monopolies, in the case of Mbesa with Safaricom, they're able to provide a service, and that service gets adopted more quickly, and the reason it does is because of the second major issue, which was touched on a little bit, which is behavior. Behavioral change matters a lot, and it trumps pretty much everything else, and it's way beyond just user experience. The use case has to be compelling. In the case of Mbesa, the use case is very compelling for a lot of obvious reasons, and in fact, if you travel there, you will find shacks on the side of the road that have no running water, no electricity, but they do have a roof-mounted antenna and a repeater system that allows for top-up and payments. So, and that's not uncommon. In China, so I was in the payments business in 11 different provinces within China. Some of those were rural, and interestingly, you mentioned Abra. Abra is a remittance business, and I am in the remittance business, both in some Central and Latin American countries and the Caribbean, as well as, in Abra's case, starting out in the Philippines and planning to spread. China's remittance business is intramural. In other words, by far the bigger part of that handle is urban to rural than it is overseas. That's true today, probably will be for some time in the future. Japan, on the other hand, the Philippines in particular, the dynamic would be completely the opposite of that. So, you know, just bringing it all back to the beginning, you've got a third-party intermediary with financial services firms, and you have to integrate with them. We live in that world today. I look at investing in things that maybe break down some of those barriers tomorrow. Second is the behavioral piece. You've got to provide something that makes sense, whether it's unbanked, underbanked, or fully banked in terms of your target audience.
Thank you. So Bo, going back to the behavioral part of this, in China, how do Chinese pay for, like there's such a variety of ways of how they pay for anything that they want these days. It's not just how we usually use it, which is let's take out our card or debit card or credit card here in the US as we're accustomed to. Can you go through all the ways that, you know, in a typical day, someone may, you know, pay for something in China?
Sure. Well, typically, originally, we all came from the card network kind of business. We started from Visa, Master, American Express as a card network to combine the general payment ability or behavioral type of spending in the U.S. China used to have what still is the same network that's called Union Pay. Everybody probably know. They have 100% of adoption rate in China. It's semi-owned by the government. So starting from 2004, every single bank card in China has that type of logo on there. So every single one would have that to be able to transact on top of it. But recent years, Alipay is definitely another unicorn that came up, and the WeChat is the uprising winner in the payment industry that's actually changing the behaviors. Sitting on the side of using the card to pay a daily transaction besides cash, and they're starting using Alipay. If you don't know that, it's similar to PayPal, like it's a wallet service that will be able to connect to all your bank cards to it. So when you go anywhere in the shop, offline right now, people, Alipay and WeChat is trying to set up the way that you can just take out your mobile and scan a QR code. It's not like similar to Apple Pay, but not exactly. But online is transforming to type in the cards and be able to pay for it to they will pop up a QR code. You will use your Apple fingerprint to authorize the transaction at the same time. It's very similar to Apple Pay that way. But either from the transition of having cash to cards to now mobile pay, definitely from user experience point of view, it's trying to, the companies are trying to find a way to minimize the efforts of spending the payments. But in real, China is very good at, again, back to the numbers and growth, like 30% growth for the mobile payments just in the Q1 of 2015. Chinese are adopting a lot of easier easier way of being able to make the transactions that way. So that in that part, China is very, very innovative about that.
Yeah, I remember there was this promotion, and again, WeChat, a lot of people who have heard about it by now here in the US, we think about it as a chat, just a way to communicate, but it's turning into a full-blown way to transact too.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's
really easily, as easy as chatting. I think you or I think Chuck sent me 100 RMB yesterday, just in my same, chat dialogue, and it's interesting how that's affecting behavior.
There's one extra fancy thing about WeChat that's very innovative. It's called Red Pocket in WeChat. That's very, very Chinese. For those of you who understand the Chinese culture, Red Pocket is when there's special occasions people give money from the other side. I was chatting with the founders for WeChat because we work with them in general, and the founders who came up with the idea of the Red Pocket. It's just so easy that people don't gather all the Red Pockets from the bank and put in the cash in there, and you forgot who gave you the Red Pocket eventually. And I think from the 9 days of Chinese New Year this year or last year, it was actually 2014, they sent over 9 million of Red Pockets on the WeChat network itself in 9 days. So it's very impressive. They're renovating the culture from China too on the payment side of it.
It's also extremely viral.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying with the behavior. It's just kind of just normal to send money in that way in a chat screen now. And Jim, I would love to hear from your perspective. How you're going back. It's almost like I feel like you were there with Smart Pay back in 2005. Went through that curve, and with things changing so fast as they do in China, what's your viewpoint now when you're looking at China versus back in 2005 versus now, and what are you interested in? What do you see that's different? That's an opportunity.
Well, I mean, so a dramatic difference, obviously, in that 10-year period. In the early days of that investment, the focus was on, as much as anything else, on top up both fast and slow. And how do you sort of take that from an atomic experience on the street corner to a digital one? There were some activities around payments for utilities and things like that. This was still an era where people queued up at the post office to make payments. So, I mean, it really wasn't that long ago. Credit card penetration in those days was about 3%. That was after 20 years of marketing on the mainland. Today it's maybe 2 to 2.5 times that. It's very, very unevenly distributed. We'll call it that. And the other thing we were trying to figure out, because gaming companies were very much on the rise, is how do we enable functionality so that people can buy digital assets and trade them. And so that was the focus then. The focus was not that much on e-commerce. There were a few exceptions to that, but the handles were much, much smaller then. The cross-border piece was obviously much smaller. And in that time, what have you had? Well, you've had, on the mainland side, an enormous creation of wealth and a sort of distribution of technology that's leveled the playing field and provided access to, most of the population at this point for devices, and they're all hungry to transact. It does astound me as we sit here in this room in 2015 at just how unaware most of the world is, not just America, although America certainly is unaware, of the size and scope of things like Union Pay and the card bases that they represent, and how many people, to use a retail term, bounce off the glass here in the U.S., i.e. they can't buy anything, and it's dramatic. I mean, this number, you could calculate it, it's probably $1 trillion. I mean, it's just an enormous number that's left on the table, over some relatively short period of time.
Okay, you're nodding there because you're like both in agreement. You can relate, but what has been the challenge of some, retailers or brands here when they know that China is a big market, but what are some of the perceptions that you come across when you go into these meetings about unlocking that, mobile payments or just online payments and cross-border payments for the China market?
Well, let's dig down to a little bit more about the consumer behaviors in China. More than 40% of all luxury goods are sold to Chinese every single year. Chinese, it has a culture of worship of all the luxury goods. Having a Burberry wallet or having a Burberry purse is just a culture, and people rather spend half of their salaries on the luxury goods just to have that, right? So they all understand that Chinese are willing to get all the good quality products overseas, and because of in China and every single card has a UnionPay, it's not. They would like everybody will have UnionPay cards with them, but not everybody has Visa or Master. So when they transact online or offline overseas in here, they usually couldn't. So they had to find their friends who might live in here, where they bring 10 piles of cash, which is extremely dangerous for bringing 100K with them on the plane. It just wouldn't work that way. So UnionPay, the reason that we're being a global, one of the few global license acquirer for global pay, for UnionPay, is because we wanted to solve that problem by help them to be able to link to all the business around the world. Yeah.
Great. And I see my warning sign that it's time to wrap up. She actually moved seats there. I'm like, I'm in trouble. Thank you so much, everyone. So, and again, really quick, Bo, you guys have a rebranding that you're actually announcing today, which is?
NiHao Pay, yeah. We're having our VIP lunch right after all the panels, and for those of you, I would like to invite you to join our soft lunch party at NiHao Pay lunch right across the hall. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine and fellow panelists.